The officer reached out his hand and said, "Ma'am, you have to remove those." She looked at him calmly. No panic. No anger. No tears. Just 3 words. And those 3 words stopped an entire airport security line cold. People put down their bags. Phones came out. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mama, what is she doing?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Because what this 72-year-old grandmother did next, in front of hundreds of strangers, was something none of them had ever seen before. And many of them would later say it was the moment their life quietly changed. Stay with me. Because this story begins not at the airport, but 47 years earlier, in a tiny room, with a dying man and a string of prayer beads. 47 years ago, Fatima was not yet a grandmother. She was a young woman of 25, sitting beside a hospital bed in a small room that smelled of antiseptic and old flowers. Her husband, Yusuf, was dying. The doctors had said he had perhaps 3 days. It had already been 5. She had not slept. She had barely eaten. She had only prayed. On the 4th morning, Yusuf opened his eyes, something the doctors had not expected. He reached beneath his pillow and pulled out a string of brown amber prayer beads. His fingers were thin. His voice was barely a whisper. "Fatima," he said. "These were my father's. And his father's before him. Every bead has been touched by hands that trusted Allah." She took them without a word. "Promise me," he said. "Whatever happens, you never let go of these." 3 days later, Yusuf passed away quietly, just before Far. Fatima kept her promise. Through the years that followed, through raising 4 children alone, through her own cancer diagnosis at 58, through the death of her eldest son, those beads never left her hands. They were not jewelry. They were not decoration. They were her anchor. Her conversation with Allah. Her way of saying, even in silence, "I am still here. I still trust you." And now, 47 years later, a stranger in a uniform was asking her to place them in a plastic tray. It was a Tuesday morning in November. Fatima had woken at 4, as she always did, to pray Far. She made herself a cup of tea, fed the small orange cat that had adopted her back garden 3 winters ago, and packed the last few items into her suitcase. She was flying to see her youngest daughter, Maryam, who lived in Toronto. The flight was long, nearly 9 hours. But Fatima did not mind long journeys. She had learned long ago that patience was not the ability to wait, but the ability to keep a good attitude while waiting. Her neighbor, Margaret, a retired schoolteacher who had known Fatima for 22 years, drove her to the airport. "You have everything?" Margaret asked as they pulled up to departures. "Everything important," Fatima said, and smiled. Margaret noticed she was already holding the beads. At the check-in desk, everything went smoothly. Fatima was efficient, organized, unhurried. She had traveled enough times to know exactly what to do. She removed her shoes before being asked. She placed her small bag of liquids on top of her carry-on. She folded her boarding pass neatly and placed it in her left coat pocket. But when she reached the security belt, when the officer looked at the beads around her wrist and said those words, something shifted in the air. "Ma'am, you have to remove those." The line went quiet before Fatima even responded. Officer Hayes had been working airport security for 11 years. He had seen everything. Nervous travelers. Angry businessmen. Crying children. People who hid things. People who forgot things. People who argued about every single rule as though the rules were a personal insult designed specifically for them. He was not unkind. But he was tired. And rules were rules. When he saw the beads on the elderly woman's wrist, he did what he was trained to do. He pointed. He spoke clearly. "Ma'am, all jewelry and accessories need to go in the tray." The woman looked at him. Not with anger. Not with fear. With something he couldn't quite name at first. Something steady. "These are not jewelry," she said quietly. "Ma'am, policy requires." "These are not jewelry," she said again. Same tone. Same steadiness. He paused. Behind her, the line had stopped moving. People were watching, not in the aggressive way of an audience waiting for a fight, but in the silent way of people who have just felt something shift. "Ma'am, I understand, but I need you to." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and said the three words that stopped everything. "They are mine. Not my beads. Not my prayer beads. Not my husband gave them to me. Just, they are mine." And something in the way she said it, the absolute, unshakable certainty of it, made Officer Hayes stop with his hands still extended, unable to finish the sentence he had started 100 times before. Nobody breathed. That is not an exaggeration. Ask anyone who was there that morning at Gate Security C. They will tell you, for approximately 15 seconds, the entire checkpoint existed in a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. A woman named Patricia, 68 years old, traveling to visit her grandchildren, would later write about it in a letter to her daughter. She described it as the kind of quiet that falls over a room when something true has just been said. A young man named Daniel, 23, a student returning from a semester abroad, said he felt an inexplicable urge to sit down. "I don't know how to explain it," he told a friend later that evening. "It just felt like a moment you're not supposed to walk through. You're supposed to stop." Officer Hayes stood with his hand still extended. Fatima stood with the beads in her hand, her expression unchanged. She was not defiant. She was not performing. She was simply present. As though she had stood in far more difficult places than this and had learned that the only thing you ever truly own is your own stillness. Then something unexpected happened. A man at the back of the line, broad-shouldered, wearing a construction company jacket, someone you would never in 1,000 years predict would do this, began to clap. Slowly. Deliberately. Once. Twice. And then the woman beside him joined in. And then Patricia. And then Daniel. And within 30 seconds, the entire security checkpoint was filled with applause, not the roaring kind, but the quiet, nodding kind. The kind that means, "We saw that, and we understood." Officer Hayes lowered his hand. He had not been ordered to. No supervisor had intervened. No regulation had changed. He simply lowered his hand. Later, when journalists would ask him about that morning, he would struggle to explain it. "I've been doing this job for 11 years, he said. "I know the rules. I believe in the rules. But in that moment, I just kept thinking about my grandmother. She had a rosary. She carried it everywhere. She said it was the only thing she owned that her mother had touched." He paused. "I thought about what I would feel if someone asked her to put it in a plastic tray." He cleared his throat and looked away from the camera. "I stepped aside," he said simply. "I let her through." What Hayes did next surprised even his colleagues. He walked Fatima to the gate himself, something entirely outside his duties. He carried her small carry-on bag. He said very little. But as they reached gate 14, he stopped and turned to her. "Can I ask you something?" She looked at him with those same steady eyes. "Those 3 words you said. They are mine. Did you plan that? Did you know what would happen?" Fatima was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, the kind of smile that takes 72 years to build, and said, "I didn't say it to you. I said it to remind myself." Hayes stood there for a long time after she walked through the gate. By the time Fatima's plane reached cruising altitude, the video was already on the internet. 3 people at the security checkpoint had filmed it on their phones. One of them, Patricia, the 68-year-old grandmother traveling to see her grandchildren, had posted a 17-second clip with a simple caption. "This happened today at the airport. I don't know this woman's name. But I won't forget her." By evening, the clip had been viewed 4 million times. Comments poured in from every corner of the world. From Muslims who wrote, "Subhanallah, this is what tawakkul looks like." From non-Muslims who wrote, "I don't share her faith, but I understand exactly what she was protecting." From elderly people who wrote about their own objects, a cross, a photograph, a ring, and what it would mean for someone to ask them to remove it. A retired pastor in Alabama wrote, "I've preached for 40 years about faith. This woman preached more in 3 words than I have in 4 decades." A professor of philosophy in Edinburgh wrote a thread about the concept of ownership, not legal ownership, but moral ownership. The things that belong to us not because we bought them, but because they carry the weight of our lives. A child in Malaysia drew a picture of an old woman with prayer beads and sent it to her mother with the message, "This is what brave looks like." But Fatima knew none of this. She was 30,000 feet in the air, her hands moving through her beads, her lips whispering quietly. She had a window seat. The clouds below were wide and white and endless. She thought about Yusuf. She thought about Maryam waiting in Toronto. She thought about how strange and beautiful it was that a life could fit inside 47 beads, one for every year she had kept her promise. Maryam was waiting at arrivals with a handmade sign. She was 44 years old, Fatima's youngest, and she had inherited her mother's steady eyes and her father's inability to hide what she was feeling. The sign said, "Welcome home, Mama." She had drawn small flowers around the letters. She had not slept the night before, too excited. When she saw Fatima come through the doors, she ran. They held each other for a long time in the middle of the arrivals hall, this elderly woman and her middle-aged daughter, while the crowd moved around them like water around a stone. "Mama," Maryam said into her shoulder. "You're all over the internet." Fatima pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. "What?" "The airport. The video. Mama, millions of people saw you." Fatima was quiet for a moment. Then she looked down at the beads in her hand. "I wasn't thinking about people," she said softly. "I was thinking about your father." Maryam's eyes filled with tears. She held her mother's hands, the beads between their palms, and for a moment neither of them spoke. That evening, they sat together in Maryam's kitchen. Fatima drank tea. Maryam read her some of the comments from the internet, the pastor in Alabama, the professor in Edinburgh, the child in Malaysia with her drawing. Fatima listened. She did not smile at the praise. She did not dismiss it either. She simply listened, with the same steadiness with which she had stood at that security checkpoint. When Maryam finished, Fatima was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "All I did was remember who I am." 3 weeks after the incident, a journalist tracked down Officer Hayes. He had not sought any attention. He had given no interviews. He had simply continued going to work, same checkpoint, same uniform, same rules. But something had shifted in the way he did his job, in ways small enough that only his colleagues noticed. He was slower now. More deliberate. When people arrived at the checkpoint nervous or flustered, he had begun speaking more gently. When elderly travelers struggled with their belongings, he had started to help in ways that were not strictly in his job description. His colleague, a woman named Sandra, noticed it first. "Hayes," she said one morning. "You're different." He looked at her. "Different how?" "Softer," she said. "Not weak. Just, softer." He thought about that on his break. He sat with his coffee in the small staff room and turned the word over in his mind. Softer. He had spent 11 years building a kind of professional hardness, not cruelty, but distance. The ability to process hundreds of people a day without being affected by any of them. He had thought that was professionalism. Now he wasn't so sure. He began doing something he hadn't done in years. On his lunch break, he started calling his grandmother, 81 years old, living in a care home in Sheffield. He hadn't called often enough. He knew that. He had always told himself he would do it more when things slowed down. Things never slow down. He called her on a Tuesday. She was delighted. She told him about the garden outside her window, about a cat that visited every morning, about a television program she had discovered. He listened to all of it. Before he hung up, he said, "Gran, do you still have the rosary? Mum's old one?" A pause. "Of course," she said. "I never put it down." He closed his eyes. "Good," he said. "Don't ever let anyone take it from you." Fatima never gave an interview. She was approached by 3 television programs and 2 newspapers. She declined all of them. Not out of pride. Not out of shyness. Simply because she felt that what had happened at the airport had already said everything it needed to say, and adding more words to it would only make it smaller. She did, however, write a letter. Not for publication, just for Miriam, to read after she was gone. Miriam found it tucked inside the lining of the small black suitcase, 3 years later. It said, "My darling Miriam. I want you to know something about that day at the airport. People thought I was being brave. I wasn't being brave. I was simply being honest. Those beads are mine, not because I bought them, not because your father gave them to me, but because every prayer I have ever made has passed through them. Every fear I have carried. Every loss I have survived. Every morning I chose to get up and continue. They are mine the way your soul is yours. No one can ask you to remove your soul and place it in a plastic tray." The officer was not a bad man. He was just a tired man who had forgotten, for a moment, that every person who passes through that line is carrying something invisible, something that matters more than anything in their luggage. I hope he remembered. I think he did. Whatever you carry in your life, my love, carry it with both hands. Don't apologize for it. Don't hide it. Don't put it in a tray. All my love, always, Mama. The beads, today, are with Miriam. She carries them every day. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of what they're carrying. And if you haven't already, subscribe. Because there are more stories like this one. Stories that deserve to be told. Alhamdulillah.